a Christian attitude. That we come together with smiles on our faces, that we visit, that we fellowship, that we encourage, that we uplift. The prayer that was led just a moment ago, was that Hunter or Tristan? I didn't look up. That was Hunter, right? Okay. Anyway, I heard somebody tell him as they got down the hall, good job this morning. That's important, isn't it? Especially with our young people. But I tell you, you don't get too old for a compliment, right? To make us feel better, to make us feel good. And, our ultimate goal is not, just to make us feel good. We're here to worship God. We're here to serve. We're here to learn. And yet that is a part of it, and a very important part of it, because if we don't feel good, if we don't get into what's going on, we're likely to go away without really receiving the benefits of fellowship and worship that God wants us to have. So I hope that all of us will be conscious of that as we look around, and hopefully all of us have a habit of speaking to folks and visiting with folks, and it's something I think that we need to constantly remind ourselves of. It's comfortable sometimes for us to find our spot, and we kind of visit with those that are right there, and with some of us, we do well to get in here and find our spot, right? But it is important for us to look around, to speak, especially if there's somebody that's visiting with us, to introduce ourselves, to let them know that they are welcome, and to make sure that we are participating in that part of the service. Another thing that we had begun to talk about here in these first few verses, beginning with verse 17, and I guess verse 20 particularly, it says, "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper." We pointed out that what they seemed to have been doing was coming together, and they had what was called a love feast, and those were very common according to history in this particular area. And it was much like what we would refer to as a fellowship meal. The problem was that they were sort of mixing that on Sundays with the Lord's Supper. And the underlying issue is the fact that they were not sharing. There were those that were wealthy and had food and could bring, and there were those that were unable to do that. And so some folks were coming in, and rather than sharing, they were eating and drinking too much, while other folks actually went hungry. And the Lord's Supper, in the process of this, was being neglected or being abused. So he talks about that in verse 21, and then verse 22, "What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you." I guess what I wanted to do, you've probably heard or maybe even feel this way somewhat. There are those that just don't believe that you should eat in the church building. How would you respond to that in light of what the Apostle Paul says here in this context? Okay, in reference to not sharing? Yeah, okay. What else? How would you respond to somebody that maybe was saying, we just really shouldn't, eat here in the building at all. We need to. What? Well, church building at all. There are those that believe that you should not eat in the church building. Yeah. Sometimes, like you say, wasn't necessarily in a building. I don't guess maybe it never was, because they didn't have buildings back then. But you're right, it was when the group came together. Good point. You say you think not? Oh, that's what I'm asking. We struggle, I think. We struggle sometimes with the point that Sean was just making. This is simply a building, right? There's nothing sacred about the building. In the Old Testament, they had the temple, and the temple was a sacred building. God was behind it, and that was the very presence of God, and they were pretty strict on what you could do. In fact, not everybody could even go in it, just your priest, and then the most holy place, just the high priest, once a year. So there were different things, and I think sometimes we struggle in making the building out to be some sort of a sacred place. Now, that is not to suggest that we have we built it and we have set it aside as a place of worship, and it needs to be respected, and there should be a degree of respect and honor there. And yet we may at times make our likes and our dislikes into rules and law, and we talked a little bit about that last week in reference to the way that we dress in the earlier part of this chapter. And the truth of the matter is, the Bible says that we are to dress modestly. And there is a warning against overdressing. And that kind of attaches to this, I think, John, in reference to their sharing or their lack of sharing. There were those that, had food, and they were not sharing with those that were poor. And Paul warns against people that had money and had wealth, wearing all of their finery and maybe making those that were doing the very best that they could with, one outfit that they wore every day. That was the best that they could do in worship. So warnings against overdressing. We think more likely today about underdressing, not having enough clothing on. But the point is, when you look at the scriptures, the emphasis is on modesty, and yet probably all of us have our opinions in reference to what maybe that means or to the degree of that. We just have to be careful about that. When it comes to the use of a church building, probably pretty much everybody has an opinion about that as well. And here, in reference particularly to this context about eating in the building, there are a couple things that I would point out. He talks about verse 22. He says, "What, do you not have houses to eat and drink in?" Well, if we went so far as to say that, you shouldn't eat in the church building at all, you need to eat at home, we might ask, well, is it all right to eat in a restaurant? If you took this literally and said you could only eat in your house, sort of back to Sean's point, that they were outside in different places. The idea is he really wasn't talking about it being wrong to eat in the building or particularly in the fellowship hall. What he was talking about was their lack of sharing and their lack of combining, it seems, a common meal with the Lord's Supper, and doing so, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, doing so in an unworthy manner. There was selfishness. There was a lack of generosity. There was a lack of kindness that they should have been ashamed of. And so Paul is condemning them for that. Anybody else with a thought or comment there? Yes. Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the eating of meat sacrificed to idols thing, doesn't it? Which we've been talking about all the way through here. And in the reading that Chuck did there just a minute ago, making it very plain there in those latter verses in chapter 10, he wasn't dealing with a right or wrong issue, but respect needed to come into that picture. And there would be certain things that we would not do, not because they were wrong, but just out of respect for maybe somebody that thinks that it might be wrong, or just to keep from upsetting folks in one way or the other. So again, it's the same idea of being conscious of other people's feelings. And we kind of started, this morning that way. How we feel, how we make one another feel. By speaking, being kind, by being courteous, by offering up a compliment. Not always looking for the bad, but looking for the good, and looking for something that you can compliment. And the church in Corinth, you remember, you go all the way back to chapters 1 and 2. One of their big issues was a lack of unity. And they had their favorite preachers, and they divided up into little sects or little groups. And they were just not really getting along really well. And we're going to get to chapter 13 here eventually. And a point that Paul's going to make is that even if they did everything right by the book, and it wasn't done out of love, then it was like that clanging cymbal. It was nothing. It didn't amount to anything. And so one of their real issues, whether you're talking about the way they were dressing, or the way that they were feasting in front of folks that didn't have anything to eat, or you're talking about the eating of meats that have been sacrificed in some pagan ritual in honor of an idol. All of those things had to be considered in light of one another in a congregation, and building people up rather than tearing people down. And it all comes, I think, together with this idea. Anybody with a thought? Yeah. And that's what Paul says in chapter 13. It all comes back to loving one another and respect. Somebody else?
What you're saying is okay for church services.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I would say that the point being is that we just need to be careful about one another's feelings and those things that are appropriate. There are things that we might say wouldn't be wrong, but it wouldn't be the best for the best type of a service. And that's what Paul, I think, was saying here. He was saying it's all right for you to come together to eat, but let's keep it there. And when we do that, make sure that you're sharing. Now, when you come to the Lord's Supper, that's a different situation. Let's don't combine the two, and let's don't mistreat one another. Let's make sure we're showing the proper respect. And, there are things that might not be wrong or sinful for us to do, but it's not the place for it, or it's not the appropriate place for it. Yeah. Now, again, we have to be careful about that, because what is respectful for me, you might not feel the same way, and we can get into judging one another, because I think that what you're doing is disrespectful. I may be condemning of you. You may not be being disrespectful at all. You may not have even thought about that as being disrespectful, not being your intention at all. So we can get to the point of being guilty of sort of judging and condemning one another when that is not the point at all. So some of those areas of judgment, and we can sure tear things apart sometimes, because we're so set on the way things ought to be done. When the Bible leaves it in those areas, they were commanded to partake the Lord's Supper, and they were also commanded to fellowship. They just had to determine how to do that and be loving, as Kathy says, the bottom line, love in all things. That latter verse of chapter 13 talks about things passing away, but love, that's that foundation there that has to be there, and we kind of destroy ourselves when we forget that. Right, plucking the grain. We get plumb ridiculous sometimes, don't we? And we take things, I think the point being is if I'm doing it, I sort of see no problems, but somebody else may see a problem with it. Now, I would say this, if my bottle of water was really causing a lot of disturbance, I'd leave my bottle of water off if I could. But it may be somebody, with that throat issue, that bottle of water, that sip of water, is pretty much essential to get that next song started and led. So, we can get kind of ridiculous that way. Sometimes somebody will bring, something little for a 2-year-old or 3-year-old. You've got those, what's those little yellow fish? Yeah, goldfish. You got things like that, and it helps keep that little one quiet, so the rest of us can worship. We can get crazy, with things. Sean, did you start to say something? Yeah, I think so, and that's what Paul was striving for, and yet Paul was wise enough, and he wrote through inspiration, to know that proper attitude was a developing thing, and you had very mature individuals, you had individuals that were brand new, You had individuals that had just been converted from idolatry. You had people that maybe were converted that very first week that Paul and others were in Corinth. So these folks have been Christians now for a few years. You got others that had not developed to that point. So the developing of that proper attitude, and as we would relate to one another, maybe that person that, is not dressing as modestly as they ought. How do I handle that? Well, hopefully we handle that by love and by teaching and by setting a good example. And my experience has been is that we're kind of creatures that want to fit in, all of us. And if you kind of look around and nobody's dressed like you, sometimes even unconsciously we start adjusting because we want to fit in. I've known situations where things were said that were very hurtful and were very condemning, and even in the tone of voice, and that person just quits. Is that what we want? That's not what we're after, is it? We're not after somebody just quitting. We're after encouraging folks. Now, does that mean overlook a problem? Not at all. But how am I going to handle that? Most of the time, if I would just think, how would I like that handled if it was me? I'd want somebody to, privately, most likely, talk to me about the situation if it was a real issue. I would like somebody to encourage me, just love. And I think we'd all feel the same way. So, developing that attitude. Yes, sir. Right.
My mother interpreted that her long hair was a glory. And her and I would have discussions over and over. And we finally decided that, I don't believe that that's going to affect her salvation or mine. And we finally decided, we just need to agree to disagree and move on.
Yeah.
Because of that very thing. And when you look at it, it wasn't going to affect either one of our salvation if she had her hair long.
The only way it would affect the salvation is if both of you got mad and said things or did something then, or actually condemned one another. So you're right. My grandmother, she pretty much let hers go as well. But one thing I always thought that was real curious, and Grandma's hair was probably way down here when she died, but she would let my aunt trim off about an inch of the frizzes. And I'm thinking, okay, Stephen, you trim off 1 inch, what would be wrong with 2? Was it worth upsetting? No. But, again, you're right. Where's our love? If you feel that way and that's what you want to do, well, we're to have love, and now we're not to make. There's one thing for me to feel that way, and that's another thing for me to demand that you feel the same way or do exactly as I do, and that's all throughout 1 Corinthians, all the way through. As you look at these different problems that they were having, so much of it is based upon what God said, and here's what has to be done, but then them taking that too far, making a law that God did not make, or disregarding the law that God made. And we deal with the same problems. not necessarily meat offered to an idol, but some of these other issues that we've talked about this morning. Let's move on into the latter part of this chapter, verses 17 all the way down through verse 34. And in this, as he develops this idea of the Lord's Supper, I wanted us to drop on down to verse 27. He said, therefore, now, anytime you see that word, he's made a point, or he has pointed out some things they needed to carefully consider, and he's saying, therefore, or because of what I have just said. So let's go back up to verse 22. He says, for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do, as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. And one of the final points that we made last week was to note that, this was kind of a sermon in acting out. When we partake of the Lord's Supper, we're basically proclaiming, the Lord's death with the bread and the blood that was shed, and we're showing reverence and respect for that sacrifice that was made for us. And if we're doing it properly, our minds are going back to that cross. And I don't know how you do that, but one of the things that I do, I had the privilege of being in Jerusalem, and just outside one of those gates you can see the hill called Golgotha, and it actually does look like a skull from one direction. There's holes in the side of the rock. It's just a rocky hill. But, I can still shut my eyes and I can see that. And it's thought that's likely where the cross actually was. And it helps me to think about that. Now, one thing I have to block out is just below it, there's a bus garage. All these old big buses parked there today, if it's still the way it was when we were there a few years ago. But just above those buses is this old ugly hill. And Jesus, when he instituted, was telling the disciples, and thus to us today, to let our minds go back there. Now, verse 27, therefore, because of what Jesus did, and because he tells us to partake the Lord's Supper, to do it in remembrance of him, therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner. Now, your text may say, use a different phrase there. In an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. Now, one of the points I wanted to make about this is that he's not saying that we can only partake of it if we are worthy, because we're not. And we've never been, and we never will be. We are sinners, and we are either forgiven sinners or unforgiven sinners. And it is only because of the grace and the mercy of God that as Christians we are privileged or honored to partake of the Lord's Supper. So as far as us being worthy, that's just not going to happen. I know sometimes we kind of mix that up in our prayers when we're praying for the bread and the juice at the Lord's Supper. And I've heard somebody say, Lord, help us to be worthy. Well, that's not going to happen. He's talking about partaking of it in an unworthy manner. Now, how would that be possible? How could we make that mistake? Okay, verse 29. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning, and I imagine that's the word that you're looking at, or recognizing Maybe your translation has another word. Anybody have another word there? Without honoring, okay? Okay, so without honoring, without discerning, without recognizing the Lord's body. And he does clear it up, doesn't he? Yeah. Careful regard. All of those ideas would come together there. So that's the problem. Is if my mind is, on lunch, if I am, more conscious on, maybe the fella on the end is not dressed maybe as well as I'd like for him to be. And I'm thinking about this person maybe, maybe they didn't know they were supposed to be up here, and maybe for one reason or the other, and I'm thinking about what that person's wearing rather than the Lord. See, that's where I get into my issues. So, to focus in, we talk about this sometimes. I don't know what you do. I mentioned one of the things I do. I like to let my mind go back, to that picture of being able to stand there and actually look at that hill called Golgotha. What do you do? What do you do to keep focus? Think about some of the specifics, like the nails. Yeah. Run that through your mind, different things. What else? Or do y'all not have any problems with this? Yes. Yeah, I do that too. The song that we've just sung, our song leaders do a good job of leading a song that has to do with that. And I'll find myself going back through some of those words of the song. On a hill far away. Just focusing in on that. I tell you, a baby can cry, or somebody could drop a book. There's just all sorts of things that, it's happened to me. All of a sudden I've realized I'm not giving a thought to this, and I bring my mind back because, point being, you can take that little piece of bread and you can drink that juice and not partake of the Lord's Supper, right? But that really applies to other things as well. Do you ever catch yourself singing and really, you're really not paying much attention at all to the words? Are we really worshiping in song when we do that? When Tristan led us in prayer, did we listen? Did we pray? If our actions have to be right, but my heart has to be there. The same way as if we don't do things out of love, we could do a lot of good things, but we need to do those things out of love for God and for other people, or it negates the whole thing. Anybody with a thought, comment there. Okay. Well, in verse 28, but let a man examine himself. So to examine ourselves, to see about our relationship, about our attitude, what we're doing, what we're not doing. Anybody else with a thought there? Okay. Finally, if you look on down to verse 34, he closes it out by saying, "And the rest I will set in order when I come." Evidently there were some more Lord's Supper questions within that context. When Paul went to visit them, and he was planning on doing that, he's going to try to finish up some of that discussion. So I guess there's always a little bit more. Next week, we'll get into chapter 12, where he's going to deal in chapters 12, 13, and 14, particularly with some of the spiritual gifts that they had. So you can continue your study there. Appreciate your comments this morning.